May 2009. During routine preservation work at Auschwitz-Birkenau, conservator Dominic Cyinewicz finds something extraordinary hidden in a bunker, a card made of white celluloid material bearing 17 surnames handwritten in pencil in block capital letters: Osborne, Lawrence, Gardner, Lamb, Symes, Saunders, Dunn, Hutton, Holmes. 3 names are illegible. Then Clark, Manson, another illegible name, Audie, Steinger. They're clearly British names, and beside 8 of them, Gardner, Dunn, Holmes, Clark, and 3 others, there are check marks. The discovery sends shockwaves through the historical community. What were British soldiers' names doing at Auschwitz, the most notorious death camp of the Holocaust, where over 1.1 million people, mostly Jews, were systematically murdered? Historians immediately begin speculating. Were these Jewish prisoners of war sent to die at the camp? Were they members of a British SS division that fought alongside the Nazis? Why were some names checked off? What did the check marks mean? Death? Transfer? Something else? The Polish historian who discovered the list issues an urgent plea for British help. They were clearly the names of English soldiers, we presume prisoners of war, but we want to try and find out more about them. But as researchers dig deeper, they uncover something even more disturbing. Hundreds of British soldiers were imprisoned at Auschwitz during World War II in a POW camp called E715, forced to work as slave laborers at the nearby IG Farben chemical factory. They witnessed the Holocaust firsthand. They saw inmates being beaten and murdered. They smelled the smoke from the crematoriums, and almost no one knew about it. Until now, today, we're exploring the mystery of the British 17 and the forgotten story of British prisoners at Auschwitz. When Dominic Cyinewicz found the list during the preservation work in an Auschwitz bunker, he knew immediately it was significant. The card was authentic. Historian Piotr Setkiewicz from the Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum confirmed it. But what did it mean? The surnames were distinctly British: Osborne, Lawrence, Gardner, not German, not Polish, not Jewish names from occupied Europe. These were English soldiers, and the check marks were ominous. In a place synonymous with mass murder, check marks next to names carried terrible implications. The Polish authorities reached out to British archives, hoping to solve the mystery. Who were these 17 men? What happened to them? Initial theories emerged quickly, each more troubling than the last. Theory 1. Jewish POWs sent to die. Some historians speculated that these might have been Jewish British soldiers who, when captured, were identified as Jews and sent to Auschwitz to be murdered alongside other Jewish prisoners. The Nazis did single out Jewish POWs for especially brutal treatment, and sending them to death camps wasn't unprecedented. Theory 2. A British SS division. More controversially, some suggested these men might have been members of a British SS division that fought alongside the Nazis. The British Free Corps, also known as the Legion of St. George, was a small unit of British POWs and fascist sympathizers who were recruited to fight for Germany. Could these 17 men have been traitors? Theory 3. Something else entirely. But both theories had problems. If they were Jewish POWs being sent to die, why keep a list with check marks? The Nazis weren't known for careful record-keeping of victims destined for immediate extermination. And if they were British SS collaborators, why would such a list end up at Auschwitz? The answer, it turned out, was more complex and more disturbing than anyone initially imagined. The shocking truth is this: hundreds of British soldiers were imprisoned at Auschwitz during World War II, and almost no one knew about it for decades. The POW camp was called E715, and it was located right next to Auschwitz III, Monowitz, approximately 2 miles from the gas chambers and crematoriums of Auschwitz-Birkenau. How did British soldiers end up at the most notorious death camp in history? After the fall of France in 1940, thousands of British soldiers were captured and sent to POW camps across occupied Europe. Initially, most were held in camps in Germany and Poland that, while harsh, nominally followed Geneva Convention rules. But by 1943, as the German war machine demanded ever more labor, the Nazis began moving POWs to work sites throughout occupied territory. One of these sites was the massive IG Farben industrial complex being built near Auschwitz. IG Farben, one of Germany's largest chemical conglomerates, was constructing a factory to produce synthetic oil and rubber using the revolutionary Buna process. The plant required enormous amounts of labor, and the Nazis provided it through slave labor, concentration camp inmates from Auschwitz, and POWs from Camp E715. In 1943 and 1944, several hundred British soldiers captured in North Africa, Greece, and other theaters were transferred to E715. They were told they would be working in a factory. What they weren't told was that the factory was part of the Auschwitz complex. When they arrived, the British soldiers were horrified by what they saw. In 2009, journalist Duncan Little was researching at Britain's National Archives when he stumbled across a document about a British POW who had been flogged. The document mentioned Auschwitz. Little was stunned. "I wasn't aware of any British prisoners at Auschwitz," he recalled. He began digging deeper and eventually made contact with 3 survivors, Brian Bishop, Doug Bond, and Arthur Gifford England. What they told him and what he documented in his book Allies in Auschwitz revealed a story that had been buried for over 60 years. The British POWs worked 12-hour shifts at the IG Farben factory alongside concentration camp inmates, Jewish prisoners from Auschwitz-Birkenau who were being worked to death. The contrast between the two groups was stark and intentional. The British soldiers, as POWs, technically had protection under the Geneva Convention. They received Red Cross parcels containing food, cigarettes, and medicine. They were allowed to write letters home. They wore their military uniforms. They could not be executed without trial. The Jewish inmates had no such protections. They were slaves. They were starved. They were beaten. They were worked until they collapsed. And when they could no longer work, they were sent back to Birkenau to be murdered in the gas chambers. The British soldiers watched all of this happen. According to Little's research, the documents clearly show that Jewish inmates were beaten and killed at the IG Farben factory. The British prisoners witnessed that. They saw people being hanged and they smelled the smoke pouring out of the crematorium a couple of miles away. One British soldier later testified, "We could smell it. The smoke. You knew what it was. Everyone knew what it was." The British tried to help when they could. They would secretly slip food or cigarettes to Jewish inmates when guards weren't watching. Sometimes they'd find ways to sabotage production or slow down work to give exhausted inmates brief respites, but they were powerless to stop what was happening. One British prisoner complained to a factory manager about being forced to work for the German war effort, citing the Geneva Convention. The manager pulled out a revolver, pointed it at him, and said, "This is my Geneva Convention." The British weren't immune to Nazi brutality either. Corporal Reynolds, a British soldier, refused to climb girders one freezing day because he didn't have appropriate clothing. He was shot dead on the spot. By January 1945, the Soviet Red Army was advancing from the east. The Nazis knew Auschwitz would soon be liberated. On January 18, 1945, SS guards began evacuating the camp. Approximately 60,000 prisoners, Jews, Poles, and others were forced on death marches westward in the middle of winter. Thousands died from cold, starvation, or execution along the way. The British POWs were also evacuated, but their march was different. Because they were POWs protected by the Geneva Convention, the Germans couldn't simply execute them. But that didn't mean the march was easy. According to Duncan Little, the POWs followed the same route taken by the Jewish prisoners a week to 10 days earlier, which meant that along the way the soldiers saw the dead bodies of many thousands of Jews. The British soldiers marched in freezing conditions with very little food. They had to scavenge to survive. The horse that carried their rations in a cart was eventually slaughtered and eaten. One survivor later recalled, "We marched past bodies, just lying there in the snow, hundreds of them, thousands maybe. We couldn't do anything. We just kept marching." In the end, the German guards, realizing the war was lost and fearing Soviet retribution, simply abandoned the British POWs. The soldiers were eventually found and liberated by American forces. After the war, the British soldiers who had been imprisoned at Auschwitz came home. But they didn't talk about what they'd seen. For decades, the story remained largely unknown. Why? First, trauma. Many of the men were deeply traumatized by their experiences. They had witnessed mass murder on an industrial scale and been powerless to stop it. They carried guilt, horror, and nightmares. Second, they thought no one would be interested. In the immediate post-war years, Britain was focused on reconstruction and moving forward. The returning POWs assumed people wanted to hear about heroic escapes and victories, not about witnessing the Holocaust from behind barbed wire. Third, they didn't think anyone would believe them. The scale of what they'd witnessed was so enormous, so horrifying, that they feared people would dismiss their accounts as exaggeration or trauma-induced delusion. Fourth, few people even knew British POWs had been at Auschwitz. Official records were incomplete. The Camp E715 was a small footnote in the massive administrative apparatus of the Nazi camp system. It was easy to overlook. It wasn't until the 1990s and 2000s, as Holocaust education expanded and as historians began combing through archives more systematically, that the story began to emerge. Some of the British veterans became witnesses at the Farben trial at Nuremberg in 1947-48, providing testimony about the use of slave labor. But even then, the focus was on corporate complicity, not on the British soldiers' experiences. Duncan Little's book, Allies in Auschwitz, published in the early 2010s, finally brought the story to wider attention. He described the British POWs as independent witnesses whose testimony provided crucial corroboration of the Holocaust, particularly important in countering Holocaust denial. So what about the mysterious list of 17 names found in 2009? Who were they, and what did the checkmarks mean? After extensive research cross-referencing British military records, historians were able to identify at least some of the men. James William Gardner was confirmed to be a member of Britain's Royal Artillery. His name had a checkmark beside it. Historian Piotr Setkiewicz traced his fate. Gardner died in a U.S. bombing raid on the IG Farben factory and is buried in Krakow's Rakowicki Cemetery. This discovery provided the key to understanding the list. The checkmarks didn't indicate execution by the Nazis. They indicated deaths from various causes: bombing raids, accidents, shootings for resistance, or illness. The list was likely maintained by German camp administrators to track which British POWs in E715 had died and needed to be reported to the International Red Cross. The Germans were required to maintain death records for POWs under Geneva Convention rules, even as they systematically murdered millions of non-combatants just 2 miles away. Other names on the list have been identified through painstaking archival research. Some were confirmed as members of various British regiments captured in North Africa or Italy. Several survived the war and returned home, never speaking publicly about their experiences. A few died during the death marches in January 1945. At least one was killed for refusing to work under unsafe conditions. The 3 illegible names on the card remain unidentified, but researchers believe they were likely damaged by water or deterioration over the decades. The card spent hidden in the bunker. Why was the card hidden in a bunker? We'll probably never know for certain. Perhaps a guard or administrator hid it deliberately as Soviet forces approached, hoping to return and retrieve it later. Perhaps it was simply abandoned in the chaos of evacuation. What we do know is that this small card, this list of 17 names, opened a window into a forgotten chapter of World War II history. The discovery of the British 17 list and the subsequent research into British POWs at Auschwitz matters for several important reasons. First, it expands our understanding of the Holocaust. The Holocaust is often taught as something that happened to others, to European Jews, to Poles, to Roma. But British soldiers were there, they witnessed it. In a very real sense, the Holocaust is part of British history too, not just European Jewish history. Second, it provides independent corroboration. Holocaust deniers have long tried to dismiss survivor testimony as unreliable or exaggerated, but the British soldiers were neutral observers, enemy combatants who had no reason to fabricate or exaggerate what they saw. Their testimony is crucial evidence. Third, it highlights the complicity of corporations. IG Farben's use of slave labor, witnessed and documented by British POWs, led to prosecutions at Nuremberg. This helped establish corporate accountability for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Fourth, it reminds us that ordinary people witnessed extraordinary evil. The British soldiers at Auschwitz were just regular men, factory workers, farmers, clerks who had joined the military. They weren't heroes. They weren't special. They were just men who happened to be in a terrible place and who tried in small ways to maintain their humanity. Fifth, it shows how easily history can be forgotten. If not for Duncan Little's chance discovery of that document about a flogged British POW, if not for Dominic Cyinewicz finding that card with 17 names, if not for researchers finally interviewing the few surviving veterans, this story might have been lost forever. The mystery of the British 17 has been largely solved. We know now that they were British POWs held in Camp E715 at Auschwitz III, forced to work at the Farben factory. The checkmarks indicated deaths from various causes during their imprisonment, but larger mysteries remain. How many British soldiers were imprisoned at Auschwitz in total? Records suggest several hundred, but exact numbers are unclear. How many survived? How many died? How many carried the trauma of what they witnessed to their graves without ever telling anyone? And the most haunting question, what was it like to be a British soldier at Auschwitz, protected by the Geneva Convention, receiving Red Cross parcels, able to write letters home, while watching Jewish prisoners being worked to death and smelling smoke from the crematoriums just 2 miles away? One British veteran, quoted in Duncan Little's book, said, "No one believed what we had seen. When we came home and tried to tell people, they thought we were mad or lying, so we stopped talking about it." Today, as the last survivors pass away, it becomes more urgent than ever to document and preserve these testimonies. The British soldiers at Auschwitz were witnesses to history's darkest chapter. Their story deserves to be remembered. The list of 17 names found in that bunker in 2009 was more than just a piece of cardboard. It was a window into a forgotten story, a reminder that the Holocaust touched more lives in more ways than we ever fully understood. Thank you for watching. If you found this exploration of the British 17 mystery at Auschwitz important, please subscribe for more hidden stories from World War II. And let me know in the comments, were you aware that British soldiers were imprisoned at Auschwitz? What do you think about their story? Until next time, remember, history isn't just about what we know, it's about what we've forgotten and what we must never forget.